But we're going to London to our first speaker, Gaby Jeliazkov. Now, you are leaving on a thing called, and I love the title of this, Just Transition. And what I love about it is it's like, stop arguing, get on with it, and just do it. There's a very Scottish way of putting this, even though you're in London. It's like the name of our tourist board is called Visit Scotland, which is quite threatening. You know, visit Scotland before we visit you. So,
I mean, it's to the point, I guess, you know.
just transition. So, Gaby, come on, get the applause emojis ready. You can even unmute for a second if you want to give us a bit of a cheer. Let's go for our first speaker this afternoon, Gaby Jeliazkov.
Hello, everyone. I don't know how I can follow that, but I'm going to try my best. So yeah, my name's Gaby. I work as a Just Transition campaigner at Platform. It's a climate justice organization in London. I'm actually from Canada though, so, you know, even farther away. But yeah, happy May Day. Really happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign that I work on, I guess. Yeah, it's basically centered around the North Sea and offshore oil and gas workers. I don't work in oil and gas myself, so I can't speak to working in the industry, but I can talk a bit about a just transition and sort of what that means and why working with oil and gas workers to build sort of transition demands or like a vision for a sustainable future is so important. It might be worth to kind of like roll all the way back and start at the beginning of COVID and the oil price crash. Obviously, the oil price crash led to a lot of job losses, but that's not new in offshore oil and gas. It points to the precarity of employment and the boom and bust cycle that governs the oil and gas industry. Over 9,000 offshore workers lost their jobs in 2020, but the crash in 2014, for instance, saw over 150,000 people lose their jobs across the supply chain. And so as climate campaigners, we knew that rebuilding or campaigning post-COVID-19 couldn't treat the situation as some sort of opportunity to accelerate reaching peak fossil fuel demand. I'm sure a lot of you people heard, you know, during COVID about how emissions went down, how use of oil and gas went down, how that was so great. But ultimately, the past year and a half has been a public health crisis. It's hit marginalized and racialized and working class communities the hardest. And any sustainable economic recovery from this has to deal with inequality first. And so, yeah, basically extending to the whole economy, not just oil and gas, we've seen the government support go to bosses, not workers. And similarly, when we talk about energy needs or the looming energy transition, it's almost always bosses' views and not workers or trade unions that dominate that discussion. And so basically, to give you a bit of context of the North Sea, tax arrangements mean that substantial state support built on liberalization and company profits have kept the industry going for a very long time. The UK government has made a net loss on taxation of the industry, with companies like Shell paying no tax and receiving a £116 million rebate from the UK government in 2019. So, you know, the UK government has been big on supporting the oil and gas industry to continue extracting in the North Sea. And as climate campaigners, we knew that we had to start by building solidarity with oil and gas workers first, as one of the most impacted groups in any transition away from fossil fuels. And so the first thing we did was conducting a survey released in a report with Friends of the Earth Scotland and Greenpeace. And we had almost 1,400 responses, roughly 5% of the offshore workforce. And so out of that, we realized that 81% of offshore workers were open to changing industries. 42% had been furloughed or let go since March 2020, and that job security was their highest concern, both with their current terms and conditions and in considering moving to any new industries. And I think that that concern with job security mirrors the rest of the UK economy, honestly, where gig work and precarious employment has been on the rise in all sectors. For offshore workers, we estimate that only around 30% are still core crew or on permanent contracts with companies, which means that very few of them have the sort of substantial employment rights or protections that you would expect out of any sort of secure or sustainable employment. And basically over 50% of them were interested in offshore wind or renewables. And perhaps the scariest statistic is that from an organizing perspective is that over 91% had never heard the term just transition. And that's quite shocking considering how much the Scottish government likes to talk about a just transition. And clearly whatever the rhetoric is that they were using wasn't making it to the actual workforce. And I think, you know, when people try to define a just transition, I think I try to push people away from like me giving a definition of it, because ultimately a just transition is whatever the workers and communities impacted by the transition define as just. And workers were very clear in follow-up conversations about the barriers they faced in retraining or skills development. Many were very frustrated with the government for the supportive training so far, and had a lot to say about training programs like the Transition Training Fund and the lack of overlap of certification between offshore oil and offshore wind. And so kind of trying to follow the idea that workers build what a just transition looks like. We had sort of hundreds of conversations with different workers, and we settled on training costs as the highest priority thing for the moment. We've been running a second survey, and we found that over 93% would support an offshore passport, which basically means that the training would basically universalize the training between offshore oil and offshore wind, so that people didn't have to pay twice for essentially the same health and safety training. And I know that for me and pretty much everyone on this call, COVID has meant that we've had to keep things online. And so we've sort of had to focus on surveys rather than meeting in person, but we're still trying to approach organizing for a just transition in a way that centers workers' voices. When communities are left out of generating solutions, solutions fail to deliver justice. And more than that, planning around skills and jobs requires workers' input because they understand their needs and they have the right to plan their futures. As climate campaigners, we need to approach environmental issues with the understanding that organized labor is key for demanding change. And that's especially important on May Day, I think. It's absolutely essential to ground climate organizing in issues that impact people's lives, like sustainable housing, food security, and good jobs. Rather than using inaccessible terminology, the climate movement needs to meet people where they are, work with the support structures that they already rely on, and build a vision for an energy future that works for everyone. So I guess for climate NGOs in the UK, that means priorities might have to change. Workers and communities need to trust that climate campaigners aren't going anywhere, and that we won't leave them behind if, let's say, renewable energy investment is promised, but there's no conditions on job security, contracts, collective bargaining. We've already seen firsthand what failure to keep promises by the Scottish government looks like, with sites like BiFab obvious hotspots for climate and labor organizers to build solidarity. But I guess basically dismantling private control over energy and recentering power in the hands of workers and communities is going to take a lot of work, probably over decades. And, you know, moving forward, we're running workshops with oil and gas workers to build demands that they want and they need. But in order to build power, we also need to revitalize trade union membership and organizing. And this means repealing the Trade Union Act of 2016 and other legislation limiting rights to strike and collective bargaining. We know that we need to end extraction in the North Sea. We know we need a plan for a managed phase out of oil and gas. We also know that the government isn't going to move fast enough, and that whatever energy transition is in the works right now won't protect the impacted workers and communities in the way that it needs to. And so we need to continue working at the grassroots, speaking to each other and building a vision for a future with demands that works for everyone. And hopefully that's what we've started doing, and that's what we're doing here. So I will leave it there because I think I'm at 10 minutes. So thanks again. Happy May Day, everyone.